thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Rose Drew, and I am with Stairwell Books with Alan Gillett. But also, I'm one of the organizers of York's International Women's Week. And they've been doing an International Women's Week here in the city of York since the 1980s, as it turns out. And so it's been not just about the day of International Women's Day, which is 110 years old this year, but it has been a week-long festival built around International Women's Day. And so that's been going for quite a few years. And I was in conversation with Dr. Katy Turton earlier this year, and I mentioned that we were having this International Women's Week, and she's got an upcoming book on women in the Russian Revolution. It's on the Russian Revolution, but it focuses on a handful of young people, and two of them are women. And I said, you know what? Gosh, that'd be really good if you gave a talk for our upcoming International Women's Week. And this is how this has come about. And so it has transpired that we've got Dr. Shane O'Rourke, who is also a Russian scholar, and he's going to be in conversation with Dr. Katy Turton, who herself is a Russian scholar, not just a fabulous novelist, as you will see. But so they're going to be talking about different aspects of the Russian Revolution. And I will let them talk about that other than me, because I'm afraid I'm not a Russian revolutionary scholar. So I'm going to have them do that. I think, Katy, would you like me to start your PowerPoint now, or would you like to do a few other things first? What would you like to do?
That would be absolutely great. And just thank you so much to you all for coming along to listen tonight, and to Shane for agreeing to interview me. I'm really looking forward to this evening.
This is wonderful. Now let me find share screen and screen 2, and I will share that. And that should be up now. Is it up now?
Yes.
Excellent. That is so dramatic. I love that. I'm going to go right to the next slide, Katy.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
How do I make it do that? Here we go. Right, there we go.
Perfect. Yeah, if you just go to slideshow and start from current slide, that's perfect if you wanted to do it that way.
Is it not doing that? Is it not on slide?
No, it doesn't seem to have gone to the slide.
It's not on full screen. It's supposed to be. I'm so sorry. It should be. There we go. How's that? Ah, I'm so sorry. There you go.
Great. Okay, shall we start then? Shall we start?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, I must say first how much I'm enjoying reading the book, Katy. I found it really gripping. I just thought we'd start off by asking you, how would you sort of put it in some sort of broader context for people who aren't specialists in Russian history, so that they can grasp the context a bit better?
So I think it's useful in the run-up to the 1905 revolution to think about two opposing forces really in Russia, increasingly coming into conflict: the conservative, if not reactionary side, and the progressive side pushing Russia towards modernity. So what I've got here is pictorial representation of the conservative side. So in 1905, we have Nicholas II on the throne. He comes to the throne adamant that he will be as strong an autocrat as his father. He says very clearly he's not interested in reform, and is a constant brake on efforts all around him to try and encourage Russia, change in Russia, improvement in Russia, and embracing of democratic and liberal change. We can't necessarily blame him, because if you like, the last experiment in great big reforms happened under his grandfather, Alexander II. He emancipated the serfs, for example, and introduced lots of other reforms. And his life ended when he was assassinated by revolutionaries. And this church was commissioned by Alexander III, his son, to commemorate his death. And you can see how it juts out into the canal. That's because the church was built over the cobblestones where Alexander II was fatally wounded by the bomb. And you can see the exposed cobbles inside. It's work began on it in under Alexander III's reign, and was still ongoing under Nicholas II, which is why I've shown you the scaffolding picture, which I love. The thing to note about the church is that it's very consciously modelled on St. Basil's Cathedral in Red Square in Moscow. So this is very much an assertion of old Orthodox autocratic Russia being built at the turn of the century as a statement of the autocracy's intent to remain intact. Rose, if you moved on to the next slide, the problem is that there are all sorts of other forces pushing Russia in the opposite direction towards modernity, towards progress. Russia has industrialized very fast and very late. So we have a huge burgeoning of working class population in the cities and all the attendant miseries that go along with that. We've got trains crisscrossing the country. We've got an increasing sort of westward looking liberal intelligentsia group that are hoping for a liberal democracy to be established. And we've also got the Silver Age occurring in Russian culture, where artists and composers and writers, they're all exploring the social ills of Russia. They're exploring modern creative processes. And you can see here, one of my favorites, Natalia Goncharova, Fruit from 1900. You can see all the trappings of modernity here in these pictures. There's Nevsky Prospect in the top left. And so these two forces are increasingly coming into conflict.
Great. How far do you think, Katy, that the real block on progress was Nicholas himself? I noticed you said that we couldn't blame him for everything, but do you feel we can blame him for a lot of things?
Yes, it's a difficult one. Yes, he is the one, as the autocrat, who sets the tone of the regime. I mean, he quite often, he's often spoken about as this loving husband and good father and sort of as a weak and vacillating czar, but that shouldn't ever be confused with moderate in any way. His first instinct in the face of popular unrest is always to send out the military. And what you find is that every so often he can be nudged in the right direction by, moderately minded, progressive minded ministers behind him, but he's just as likely to replace them with reactionary conservatives who will support his project of maintaining the autocracy. In the end, he runs the country. He is the one who can decide how Russia will process.
Yes, I agree with that. I think it does, an awful lot does come back on him and the tone he sets, as you rightly said. How did it come about then that, in 1905, a revolution broke out in the country? How do you explain that? I mean, it's one of the central events of the book. So how would you explain that?
1905 is an interesting combination. Any of you who know about the 1917 revolution will see some similar factors, but in the run up to 1905 we have this combination of growing discontent and if just enough concessions, just enough breathing room for things to develop. So, for example, we've got growing domestic hard times within the country. We've got worker discontent with long hours and low pay and horrendous living conditions and so on. But they also get a concession in the run up to 1905 where state-sanctioned non-socialist worker organizations are permitted. And while on the one hand they come into contact with socialists and illegal revolutionary activities, they also now have this voice, this legitimate voice, which becomes a focal point for them. Similarly, while Nicholas has been quite determined to clamp down on the liberals, again, we get this small breathing space just in the run up to 1905 where a slightly more moderate Minister of the Interior comes into power and allows, or certainly doesn't put a stop to, a huge banqueting campaign where professionals of all stripes, engineers, doctors, lawyers, come together in these huge banquets to talk about liberal reform and democratic reform. the next thing, of course, we've got to bear in mind is that Russia finds itself at war, which is one of the key parallels with 1917. Nicholas and some of his colleagues think that one solution to bring the country together will be a short, successful war. So they essentially pick a fight with the Japanese, assuming in their racial prejudice that the Japanese will be an easy foe to defeat. But in fact, of course, the Japanese inflict a series of stunning victories on the Russians at land and at sea. And all the attendant miseries that go along with war are compounded by this national shock and humiliation. And of course, we've got the revolutionary parties. We've got a burgeoning set of revolutionary parties. They've been clamped down under Alexander III. They're regaining strength under Nicholas II, and they're constantly active to try and promote the revolution.
So what you're saying, in other words, is that there's a whole series of events, long-term and short-term, coming together in 1904, 1905 to actually push the regime over the edge and to bring us this revolution. One of the, as I say, striking parts of the book is your description of Bloody Sunday, what happens there. Could you say something about that, and particularly about Father Gapon, this sort of mysterious priest, charismatic man who, you know, is such an important figure, at least at the beginning of 1905.
Yes, he certainly is a key figure. So, as I said, there are these state-sanctioned workers' organizations, and Gapon founds the Assembly of Russian Factory and Mill Workers in St. Petersburg. It's a sort of unprecedented moment, really, for Russian workers, that they have this legitimate way of gathering together to talk about their grievances and to try and come up with solutions. Gapon comes up with the idea of staging a loyal, peaceful march to the Tsar to put in a traditional petition to him, to appeal to the Tsar directly to make changes. It's really important to understand that while he certainly dresses it up as a loyal petition to the Tsar, if you actually look at the petition, there are more radical demands than you would expect in it. Lots of calls for democratic reform, economic reform, and so on. But still, the march goes ahead. They've got icons, they're singing the national anthem, they've got pictures of the Tsar, there are women and children. And of course, it all goes wrong. Nicholas II has no interest in meeting with them, and in fact is not in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. He is off at Tsarskoye Selo. The military are deployed to meet this crowd, and to disperse them, the military fire on the protesters. Numbers, of course, are impossible to pin down on how many people are injured or killed, but there's enough to shock the whole of Russia, and even on an international level, there's shock as well. The fundamental thing that happens is that it unites Russia in absolute opposition to the Tsar. So the liberals, the socialists, the workers, they're all in lockstep that this cannot be allowed to stand. And it becomes a real turning point that provokes a whole year and longer of unrest.
Yeah, as you say, the event precipitates the whole revolutionary year and into the next year as well. And again, you know, your book centers around that and the revolutionary movement. Why did you decide to focus specifically on the women in the revolutionary movement? Why? What was the reasoning behind that?
I suppose it's partly just my own academic interest. I've always researched women's history. So that there's sort of a completely practical aspect that is where my knowledge base is. But on the other hand, there are so many extraordinary women in the revolutionary movement, and they're absolutely fascinating. They're intelligent and educated. They don't care about the patriarchal assumptions of the society in which they live. They see injustice in Russia and want to fight and change it. And they kind of roll up their sleeves and get on with it. So, you know, whether they're part of the Social Democrats and working on propaganda and agitation, or whether they are all the way through to the terrorist side of revolutionary activity, they have, above all, they have agency and drive and an independence that's really tremendous.
Yeah, so you clearly admire them. You admire what they did and what they stood for, and the sacrifices that they made.
Yes, I think I do. Obviously, when we get into the point of terrorism, there are moral questions that have to be grappled with, and I'm certainly not advocating that we all go out and become terrorists to resolve our social problems. But as a cohort in history, you can admire them as a cohort in history as sort of great reminders to us of the way that women can break down all the barriers that would seek to contain them, I think. Yeah,
I mean, I was quite in the Church of Christ the Saviour in Moscow now. There's a big monument to Alexander II, and on the inscription to that, it's called the Tsar Liberator, and then it says murdered by terrorists. It says he freed the Russian people from slavery and murdered by terrorists. And of course, that's a complete change in attitude from the Soviet time, which looked on the People's Will, the organization that killed him, of which a woman was the joint leader, as heroes, as precursors of the Bolsheviks themselves. Whereas now the official attitude seems to be that they were terrorists, actually, that they were a terrorist cell and their act was a terrorist deed. What's your take on that?
Well, I suppose in contemporary Russia, that stance is entirely understandable, because any government that isn't keen to see any kind of political dissent and is very keen to keep a docile population, they don't want any kind of hero worship of terrorists who take matters into their own hands and go after leading figures. It's also a sort of interesting part of Soviet history too, though, isn't it? Because there is that, Lenin and his successors spend a lot of time persecuting the socialist revolutionaries as a threat to their own government, and yet some women terrorists, particularly the earlier ones who assassinated Alexander II, they do find this heroic status, and it helps sort of shield them through a lot of the horrors of the 30s.
And why do you think that some women were attracted to the terrorist side of the revolutionary movement that took part in, like Sofia Perovskaya, that took part in the SR hit squads as well? What was it that attracted them, do you think, to it?
This is it's funny. This is a question that terrorists themselves grappled with. Not all terrorists were executed. Some were in prison. Some survived or fled Russia. And the revolutionaries themselves do a lot of soul searching about why they embrace terrorism. And they're faced with living with their actions. You do get a certain sort of strand of memoir by sometimes by male revolutionaries, sort of talking about the crystal pure souls of these terrorist women, and sort of talk about them as having these special female characteristics that made them particularly good at being terrorists. To be honest, I'm not so keen on that kind of that use of gender, the sort of that somehow women are a different category. I think what comes across strongly is two factors that draw women in. The first one is about finding other people that believe that terrorism is the right thing to do, that is necessary. They form these intense bonds with other people who are in favor of terrorism, whether it's a romantic relationship, whether it's a friendship. They become a sort of mutually reinforcing set, much like men who enlisted together in groups in the First World War. So there's that aspect. It's finding like-minded people, and the way they justify it amongst themselves is that they are actually meting out justice to individuals who have abused their power and will not be brought to justice in any other way. So other than the Tsar, they target regional governors, prison governors who run particularly harsh regimes, military leaders, ministers of the interior, all sorts of people who can act with impunity in violent suppression of the people. And the other thing that a lot of the women have in common, and with other terrorists as well, is that while they think it's justified, they don't necessarily think it's a good thing to do, but they're prepared to sacrifice their own lives for it. So they think that they will commit their act of terror and then they themselves will be executed. And so the circle of justice will be complete, as it were. And that's how they get through it.
Yeah, and do they have particular problems with violence? Did you notice any difference between how they rationalized their use of violence and the men did, or did they share this sort of common sense of purpose, justification, and that, you know, the ends justified the means? Or did they have any different attitude, did you find?
I don't think so at the time. I mean, I think in the soul search, there's a huge amount of soul searching afterwards, you know, amongst the women who end up in prisons together in groups, you know, who've all committed terrorism. There is a lot of soul searching and not necessarily regret, but guilt, at least, that, you know, they've participated in it. But, you know, at the time, you know, you can look at things like the speeches they make when they are tried. You know, they're given the right as defendant to defend themselves. And in those moments, they are confident in their choices to do it. And, you know, I think in the end, we always come back, you know, no one was coerced into being a terrorist. You know, these are people who have volunteered for it. You know, they could back out until the very last moment. And so in the moment that they do it, they want to do it. They believe it's the right thing, and they do it.
Yeah. I mean, I was quite struck by the way in the book, Rosa is sort of increasingly horrified by her brother's sort of immersion into violence. First of all, beating up that police spy at the meeting, and then you know, bumping someone off as well. You know, that sort of you know, that for her to realize her brother is capable of that. What was your thinking there when in this part?
I think I was always quite keen to show you know, the lack of consensus amongst revolutionaries. I mean, the socialist revolutionaries in particular, this is the party that conducts terror. You know, the Social Democrats, the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks, it's not that they're opposed to violence, they just don't think terrorism is particularly useful. You know, they'll conduct bank robberies, for example. But the socialist revolutionaries, they're an umbrella party, really, that they move from the most moderate propagandists right the way through to the combat organization. And certainly it's possible for different views to be held even within a family. I mean, if you think about Lenin's family, his brother was part of a plot to assassinate the Tsar. Lenin himself didn't take up that mantle. He chose not to use terrorism. So I think all the way through the book, I'm trying to sort of represent as many different conflicting views in Russia as possible, really.
Yeah. Yeah, because again, another thing that I thought you did really well in the book was you showed the sort of moral certainty of the terrorists, the surety that, or not the terrorists, sorry, the revolutionaries, that they were right, that it was perfectly justified, and that their actions, you know, were going to create, you know, lead to this wonderful society in the future. Of course, they don't know what we know. We know where it ended up, that it ended up in the, you know, the gulags of the 1930s, of Stalin's camps, and yet. As I say, I find that moral certainty quite striking. The fact that, you know, there doesn't seem to be doubt that this is right, that we've made the right decision and it's justified. And I thought that came across really well in the book, especially in Boris. You know, that sense that he doesn't seem to express any doubts at all about what, you know, path he's taken.
I think there's a couple of factors there. I mean, not all revolutionaries were 20-somethings, but I think particularly amongst the students, the young revolutionaries, you know, I think we all remember being hotheads and completely committed to our view of the world in our 20s. You know, nobody can tell us that we're not thinking in a nuanced way in our youth. I think maybe the other source of certainty is that the autocratic regime is constantly hits back, and it's a constant opponent, so that every time the autocracy gets it wrong and doesn't give and doesn't change and doesn't reform, it reaffirms all the beliefs that the revolutionaries hold, that the only way is to fight. Even the 1905 results in the October Manifesto, which introduces a legislative assembly, it introduces civil liberties, it introduces the vote, and almost immediately the Tsar pulls back on it, reasserts his power as an autocrat, changes the voting systems and so on, and brutally suppresses peasant uprisings. So the autocracy never always proves to be exactly the horror show that the revolutionaries think it is.
Yeah, it's again, you come back to I can't keep coming back to the stupidity of Nicholas, his failure to understand that repression just wasn't enough, that at some point there had to be some more creative solution, and yet he obviously never found that, and blundered on regardless. Again, in the sort of late 19th century, when Dostoevsky was criticizing the terrorist movement, or the revolutionary movement, one of the characters in The Devil says that he's laid out his plan for this perfect future, and he says, I start from a position of perfect freedom, and somehow I keep ending up in despotism, and he can't quite work out where he's gone wrong. And again, it seems to be quite prophetic. How do you deal with that problem? The fact that you know what happened, they don't know what happened, and
you mean in terms of the protagonist in the novel? How do they?
Yes,
yeah. Well, to be honest, I find it's great. It's really playful, because you can have a small nod and wink to the readers as well, where, I've got one character who says at some point, we will never let the revolutionaries win. Can you imagine what we would do if they were in power? And of course, my characters, of course, are outraged that the revolutionaries would be anything other than perfect when they finally gain power. But of course, for the readers, we know that they're not going to be perfect, and that actually, things are going to descend very quickly into another bloodbath. So in that respect, it's it's nice to be able to look over the heads of the characters and share a nod with the reader there. Yeah,
as I say, they don't know what's waiting, 10, 20 years down the road for them. We do, and as I say, that does make for quite striking, or it makes an impact, I think, on the reader. Can you say something about some of the individual women who actually participated in the terrorist movement, so we get some sense of who they were and what they did, something about them?
Yes, I think that'd be nice for people to see, actually. Rose, if you could zoom on to back onto the PowerPoint and go on to Dora Brilliant. We'll go past Sophia Perovskaya. Yeah, so Dora Brilliant, yes. I've chosen her not just because her name is just excellent. Brilliant in Russian means diamond, or as one of the meanings. So, you can think of her as Dora Diamond or Dora Brilliant. So she's on the scene in the run-up to the 1905 revolution. She trains in midwifery, in fact. But, like I was saying, it's all about the relationships she's formed. So she joins the revolutionary movement through student unrest and is exiled to Poltava. And there she meets Gershuni, who's one of the key figures in the combat organization in the SR party. And he brings her in to the terrorist wing of the party. And she, because of her sort of medical background, she did chemistry as well. And so very quickly she's recruited to be a bomb maker, and is part of a terrorist cell working in St. Petersburg. And they have all sorts of plans. Unfortunately, by this point, they're being led by Azef, who is, of course, a double agent with the secret police. But nonetheless, she is part of a successful plot to assassinate Pleve, who was a particularly horrible Minister of the Interior. Rose, if you go on to the next slide, we can see here the aftermath. So, the kinds of methods they're using is, they plot the route of the Minister of Interior, and then they throw a bomb at the carriage. And you can see here the remains of the carriage. You can see the police cordoning off the area. Dora Brilliant is arrested very soon after this, is imprisoned in the Peter and Paul fortress in St. Petersburg, and in fact suffers a mental collapse and dies in a few years later. And you can see it by this point, whereas they were prepared to hang Sofia Perovskaya for her role in the assassination of Alexander II, the autocratic regime doesn't really like executing women because it doesn't want to make them martyrs. That will actually switch around in 1906 again as the revolution proceeds. They will go back to executing women, but at this point they prefer to exile them or imprison them. The other important woman in the 1905 period, oh Rose, we seem to have gone over to your email, is Maria Spiridonova. You know, she's born into the minor nobility. She's on the next slide. She becomes a member of the SRs as well, and she commits her terrorist act in Tambov. So as the peasants revolt in and begin to rebel during the 1905 revolution, we get the formation of the so-called Black Hundreds, which are right-wing vigilante groups, for want of a better word, that inflict violence on the peasantry, suppress unrest, and commit massacres. And Spiridonova shoots the leader of the Tambov branch of the Black Hundreds. Now, she reaches international fame is the wrong word, but she becomes internationally known because when she is arrested, she is beaten and tortured by her guards and in all likelihood sexually assaulted. And when her sister visits her in prison, she's able to smuggle out a testimony by Spiridonova about her treatment. And this is published widely in Russia and internationally as well. She is sentenced to exile in Siberia, but her train journey is extraordinary. If you go into the next slide, Rose, so she is known as one of the Shesterka, the Six, and these women were all terrorists. And so they are transported together into exile, but everywhere they went, every station they stopped at, they're met with well-wishers. Spiridonova makes speeches, they're given flowers, and even when they arrive at the prison complex, the prison governor comes out and shakes her hand and sort of welcomes them all in. So so even as the Tsar is beginning to clamp down on the 1905 revolution and bring it to its end, there is still widespread sympathy for the terrorists and the revolutionaries. Spiridonova will go on to have a long revolutionary life and will reappear in the 1917 revolution. So.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at these women, you can see they're women not from the peasantry, not from the working classes. They're women either from the middle or the upper classes. Why do you think these women chose to get involved? I mean, they're not personally experiencing, you know, the oppression of the Tsarist regime. In fact, they're the privileged parts of it. So why do they get involved?
I think it's partly to do with their access to education and getting off to the universities. Lots of them start a university career. Usually it's cut short, in fact, by their revolutionary activity. But universities are really the hotbed of radicalism at this point. This is where you meet fellow revolutionaries, and it's from these that you springboard into them. So that's partly it. Having said that, you know, there's something about being wealthy that creates a kind of freedom for women as well to break past the gender barriers. So there's been recent research done on a woman called Countess Panina, who's another phenomenal woman of the pre-revolutionary period. She is unimaginably rich. She doesn't become a terrorist but a revolutionary, but she dedicates her entire life to education, welfare and philanthropic work. She'll eventually crop up in the revolutionary government of February 1917. And there is, in the end, there's something empowering about having money. And of course, the revolutionary movement itself relies a lot on the money that these rich women can bring in, because they need huge amounts of money to make bombs, to travel around the place, to escape from exile as well. So it gives women a certain amount of power that they wouldn't otherwise have.
Yeah, and do they, how can I say this? Are they accepted into the revolutionary movement by the men? Do they accept them as equals, or do they sort of treat them as, you know, your job's to make the tea and sandwiches while we talk on. I mean, that does actually happen once in the book, I think, as well, where the men sit down to read the papers and they ask the two women to make the tea for them or something, and Rosa complains, obviously. So.
Yeah, I mean, the socialists, all of them, in all the socialist parties in their party programs, commit to women's equality. But of course, there's always a vast gap between theory and practice. What you find is in the sort of the non-terrorist areas where it is about agitation and writing theories and reaching out to the workers, it's much more likely that women are going to be sidelined into these roles of keeping safe houses, keeping the men fed, writing messages, encoding letters and so on. Not all of them, I mean, some women break out of that. But curiously enough, in the terrorist organisation, maybe because they're so far outside society, women find greater acceptance, I would say. And as I say, they can be bomb makers, bomb throwers, they carry weapons, they're right in amongst with the men plotting the next assassination. So curiously enough, in the terrorist organisation, I'd say it's the most equality they could expect to get in the revolutionary movement.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that, because I mean, teaching a course on the revolution now with third years here at York, when we're talking about the promises the Bolsheviks made to women, the legislation they changed, and the way that they were going to liberate women. Part of the problem was, it seems, they never looked at themselves or saw that the problem might not just be capitalism. Actually, it might be within the men in the party as well, that their attitudes actually were, you know, deeply patriarchal, and that so many of them just didn't take women seriously. And dismiss them, and say that the Bolshevik Party itself was incredibly masculine in its ethos. And I don't know, would you like to say a few words about that sense that the men in the revolutionary movement never really sort of came to terms with women's equality, just said it's all capitalism's fault and we'll get rid of it, and that's that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can't really, like you say, you can't really get around the fact that there is simply, you know, patriarchy is an incredibly powerful force, and you know, the same kinds of things happen whether it's the revolutionaries or not. So when the provisional government is established in February 1917, lots of the wives and the wives of politicians who are now setting themselves up as a liberal government come to the Tory palace saying, give us a job, and they hand them typewriters to go off and start writing letters. And it doesn't occur to them to start letting them into cabinets and so on. And similarly in the revolutionary movement, you're right, the political culture, once the Bolsheviks have established power, is, yeah, you're right, is incredibly male dominated. And we have this sort of curious, it is a kind of a push-pull thing, you know, women are sort of are pushed out, and very few of them seem to have I don't know what you would call it, the self-belief, the guts, the desire to push their way into these areas. I think quite often you find that women who have been incredibly useful in the underground, they find a niche, they find a place where they can just roll up their sleeves and get on with stuff, and they're happy to accept that, which means that they are in the end sidelined, you know. So they all go off to the Department of Education under Lunasharsky, for example, where they find something they can do that's useful. And those that do try and find a way in, like Kollontai, you know, are consistently subjected to sexism and abuse and so on. Yeah, it's one of those devastating things about revolution, that it's all promise, and you've really got to watch those revolutions when they actually get power, because they fall back into just the same old terrible habits.
Yeah, I mean, on your work on Lenin and his sisters, I mean, did you find that pattern replicated itself there, that they sort of, you know, were looking after the great man, that, you know, Lenin himself seems, you know, sincerely committed to women's liberation, but somehow that role gets replicated yet again, even in someone, you know, who does seem to be really committed to it.
Yeah, with Lenin, I've always felt with Lenin that he's very good at talking about it in the right way, but even, you know, the extent to which he's personally committed to equality, you know, like from the moment where Krupskaya goes out to join him in exile, where she's the one who's supposed to wake him up in the morning, to telling Inessa Armand that he only respects 2 or 3 women, you know, to his absolute sexism towards Kollontai, that, you know, the fact she's had more than one relationship just seems to cause his brain to melt, you know, he just can't cope with it at all. So, and yes, within that, but again, curiously, you know, there's no reason why Lenin's sisters shouldn't be more prominent and more proactive. They've had the same educational upbringing, they've had the same experiences as Lenin, and yet he goes forward as a theoretician and they do not. They choose auxiliary roles and don't push themselves forward. So there is that frustration of not, you know, it's hard to know what's more powerful, the being pushed out or them not pushing themselves forward. It's hard.
Yeah, but as you say, the one woman who does it, Kollontai, is very quickly frozen out, actually, and she's sort of removed from power, and she ends up as ambassador to Sweden. But you know, I suppose there are worse places to end up in Stalin's Russia than ambassador to Sweden. But anyway, so when you, I mean, how closely did you stick to events in the novel? How much license did you allow yourself to, you know, move away from, you know, what you could find in an archive or in a, you know, an academic work?
Well, I mean, the beauty of writing in such an intense period is that the framework of events is all there for you, and while you can, you know, really in the sort of the domestic scenes, the private scenes between characters, you can allow your imagination to take flight, but it really helped. It was a sort of security thing, actually, to sort of be grounded in knowing what events you were going to build up to. And it's great fun, you know, writing, you know, your characters being at the Bloody Sunday, for example, you know, because you know the event and now you can see it through someone's eyes on the ground. But it's funny, I found too, though, that my historical knowledge was sort of hopelessly inadequate in other ways, because when I started writing, I needed to know things like, how did workers get fresh water, and, you know, what was on the menu at the swankiest restaurant in St. Petersburg, and what was the swankiest restaurant in St. You know, and so I found I had to do a whole load of other research to get a real sense of the authenticity of the homes, their lives, even things like how long it would take them to walk from one place to another, and so on. So it was a nice, some of it was handed to me on a plate, and some of it I had to sort of fill in myself. And
do you think it would be easier if you hadn't been a professional historian by trade, if you hadn't felt so constricted by that? Or
I think it would have been incredibly hard. Like I couldn't imagine ever trying to sit down and write a novel based in the American Revolution or something like that. I can't imagine starting from scratch. You know, having, I don't know, whatever 15 years of Russian history behind me is a very nice thing to, you know, solid ground to walk on as you try and think up all the other stuff. You know, if I manage to write a sequel to this, my big problem is going to be that nothing really happens between now and the First World War, so I'm really going to have to invent it all. So yeah.
Did you enjoy writing in this way rather than an academic paper or an academic book? Did you enjoy the process?
Oh, but yeah, very, very much. It's so liberating compared to, you know, never having to worry about a footnote is just tremendous. And yes, when I was in the last few months of my job at Queen's, you know, I'd be flying back and forth to Scotland, and I'd be sitting down supposedly reading another article to prepare for a class, and I've got lots of printed out articles that the entire margins are full of my scribblings of the novel, because that just took over. You know, it was just so immersive, and, you know, just to feel, you know, to get the next scene coming together. And yeah, no, it was great. It was really good fun.
Yeah. And how long did it take?
The first draft, which of course you imagine is perfect, came very quickly. It maybe took about, I don't know, about 12 months. And then it probably took about another 2 months to actually make it something that's worth seeing the light of day, you know. And you know, there's lots of lovely people in the audience today who read it and helped me and suggested things. And yeah, so in that respect, it's very like academic work, you know, that you write your article, but you've still got 8 reviewers to get it passed before it can be published. So
yeah, it's could you see yourself doing this full time? actually, as a full-time novelist? Or
I think I think my husband would kill me if I actually gave up a paying job. You know, I mean, I understand that I'm not going to ever make any money from this, but I don't think I'll ever give it up now that it started. I think it will be part of the life that I lead now. Certainly, I've got to see Anna, Rosa, and Boris to the conclusion of whatever that may be for them. So yes, I'll always try and combine it with my academic work, definitely.
You know, a trilogy would be good.
The thing is, I mean, the reason I took 1905 as my starting point is because, I mean, there is horror and violence, but there's still hope. And I can't imagine having to write about the revolution and the Civil War years, where the descent into the worst atrocities of humanity. You know, it's going to be incredibly difficult to keep the same tone, I think, as the first book when I'm dealing with that kind of subject matter. So. Yeah.
Of course, everyone's older, wiser, and sadder then as
yes.
well, aren't they?
Well, very much so. Yeah.
Great. Well, I don't know. Does that seem okay, Rose? Is that or?
I think that's wonderful. And when I was trying to mess around and see if anyone was coming in the waiting room, the Zoom picture went away, and apparently you saw my email. So it's sorry about that. But I think that really has been wonderful to hear the background of this book. We went really quickly past this beautiful image of the October 1900, I think, whatever it is, I should know.
Yeah.
There's a few pictures we went by. Let me see. There's this one. I just love this image.
Yes,
I just love this.
I'm a huge fan of Ilya Repin. His paintings are amazing, and he's you know, in a lot of respects his work is a sort of social conscience. And here is his tremendous picture about the issuing of the October Manifesto, which really was a sort of revolutionary document. I mean, if it had been followed through properly, it really could have transformed Russia. And of course, it's all red, white, and blue because of the colors of the Russian flag. But it's yes, the celebration, the relief, the liberation that you can feel in the crowd there is tremendous, I think.
I think that's a wonderful image to end on, and I'll go blazing past the last few. I don't think we've missed and maybe we'll just get to it another time. But I think the conversation that you've had now between you and Dr. O'Rourke has just been wonderful, and has really been a great amount of background. And I was wondering if you wish to, let me end the screen share. I was wondering if you wish to now perhaps to read a little bit from the book.
Oh, I'd love to. So I've taken the first section from chapter 2 of the novel, which is called A New Beginning. It's St. Petersburg. It's the summer of 1903. And this is us meeting Anna, one of the key characters for the first time. Sergei sat with his family in the dining room, savouring his morning kasha, sweetened with the first cherry jam of the season. This was his favourite time of day. He was rested and ready for work, but as yet not obliged to deal with either the daily running of his factory, nor aware of any crises requiring his special attention. His wife, Yelena, sitting opposite him, was beautiful in the morning, dressed simply with her hair loose and her ears and throat unadorned with jewellery. Little Kolya was temporarily quiet as he did battle with his breakfast, and Anna, who was never loud, was positively silent as she pored over a newspaper. Sergei wrinkled his nose. Would the smell of paint never go away? The room, like the rest of the mansion, was newly renovated, courtesy of the current boom in the railway industry. While this and the gleaming table laden with food were pleasing evidence of the daily provision he made for his loved ones, the sharp tang of paint he could do without. No matter. He left the rest of his porridge uneaten and decided that this was the moment. So be it, Anna. If you cannot be remarried, you may as well be educated. Sergei allowed himself some satisfaction at having the final word in a conversation he'd been having with his daughter for months now. He knew he was giving her everything she had asked for, but at least he had done so at a time and place of his choosing. Anna had waged a relentless campaign to persuade him to allow her to attend university. She was determined, she kept saying, to study and then do something useful with her life. She did not want to be dependent on her parents forever, and she could not stand to be idle any longer. Sergei had tried for some time to dissuade her from this course. It was not that he opposed the education of women, and he could see that Anna was bored and restless after 2 years at home. He simply worried that she would not be able to cope with the rigour of academic work, and he wanted to protect her from any kind of anguish. Anna had dismissed this objection, saying that she was more than ready to enter society again, but still Sergei had hesitated. Then, 2 evenings ago, during yet another long discussion about Anna's future, Yelena had wondered if Anna's growing frustration might not be more harmful than trying her hand at higher education. The latter might at least be a positive distraction. Trust a mother to know her daughter's heart the best, he had thought, and immediately agreed. Yelena knew her husband's heart too, though, and had let him announce their decision in his own time. Having said his piece, however, he wondered if his phrasing had been a touch clumsy. Yelena had glanced anxiously at Anna at the reference to marriage. But no, Anna's eyes were alight, and Sergei thought ruefully how long it had been since he had seen her so happy. Yelena smiled at the sight too, but before she could make Anna self-conscious, she gave her attention to Kolya, who had jam smeared across his rosy face. Sergei took the cue and continued eating his porridge. Thank you, Papa, Anna said in a wavering voice. Then she coughed. I'll need... Yes, it's all dealt with. He counted off his fingers to prove it, shaking his head at the bureaucratic nonsense he had had to endure. I've written to the director, giving my permission for you to attend, guaranteed that you will be living at home with us and not in some private flea-bitten student flat across town. I have paid the fees and finally given assurances that we can adequately fund your 4 years of study. I have even obtained the certificate guaranteeing your political reliability from the city police. The light in Anna's eyes abruptly went out. Were they not interested in my exam results at all? Of course, Dorogaya. In the end, without your gold medal, you would not have been accepted. Then Sergei let a twinkle creep into his eyes. But now that you are to be a studentka, you must promise not to take up smoking, not to become a nihilist, and you absolutely must not cut your hair short like all those other girls. He was relieved to see Anna laugh. You are showing your age, Seryoja, Yelena exclaimed, radiant as she laughed too. The nihilists were around when you were a boy. It's the socialists we have to worry about now. She finished cleaning Kolya's face, gave him a kiss, her long blonde hair mingling briefly with his fair mop, then moved on to matters more important than threats to the Tsar. We'll have to get some new clothes ordered for you, Anushka, hard-wearing and insensible colours, so they won't show the dust from the lecture hall and library, she said, wiping her own hands. And you will need new shoes, gloves and a decent hat. I'll need a proper bag too, Anna added. Trust you to find a way to turn this into a shopping expedition, Yelenushka, Sergei teased. Your mother spends all Papa's money, Kolya. Thank goodness boys don't need new things. I do, a new toy. I'm sure we can get you something new to celebrate my matriculation at the Bestuzhev Higher Women's Courses, Anna said, playfully enunciating each word with special formality. What's that? Asked Kolya. University, almost. Someday they will let us study alongside the male students as equals. Sergei dropped his spoon with a clatter into his empty dish in mock outrage. That's precisely the sort of talk that leads to short hair, Anna.
That is very good. I was curious, why did you choose that particular segment of the book to illustrate, to follow on, should I say, your discussion about women in the revolution?
I think it's for several things. I love the family dynamic between Anna and her parents, and I think it's important. One of the theories that sort of floats about terrorists is that, and revolutionaries is, somehow they must have had something sort of trauma in their past. Somehow that something terrible must have happened to them to put them in on this extreme path. And in a lot of cases, that's just not the case. They're from loving homes. They're wealthy. They've got every opportunity. Here's Sergei sending Anna off to university. And yet still, without giving too many spoilers away, she's going to find herself on this revolutionary path. And it's not because she's traumatized. It's because she genuinely believes that there is injustice in Russia, and that the fight has to be taken to the autocracy to make things better for everyone.
Yes, right. That is very good. That is very good. I think what I would love to do now is all the people who've been listening. If there's anyone who wishes to ask a question, you can put it into the chat, and I can read it out to Katy, and Katy can respond. Or if you wish, and remember I am recording it, or if you wish, you can unmute yourself and ask the question. And I would just we just hope we don't have a wild scrum for that. But I think that people could just go ahead and unmute themselves. And if two people find themselves talking, just one person will talk, I think is the best way. It'd just be like raising your hands. You know, you could even raise your hands if you want, but I'm not sure I'd be able to see all the faces. So I think I'll ask the first question. So you're a scholar. We've all, certainly you and I and Shane have written academic articles, and we're also, I don't know about Shane, but we're creative writers. So when did you decide to write a novel? And then I will take Amina's question. When did you decide? When did this come to you that you couldn't put this in an academic paper? What happened, Katy? What went wrong?
Yeah, no, exactly. Do you know, it's really hard to pin it down. You would think I might sort of remember vividly, but I remember reading an interview with one author who, when she decided to start out as an author, she sort of took the pressure off herself by deciding she'd write a practice novel first, and that was a penny dropping moment, because I suddenly thought, okay, you don't have to do it all at once. And you know, I remember years ago, my dear friend Monica, who's in the audience, once asking me if I had ever thought about writing a novel about Lenin's sisters, because I had just written about them. And so I think the two things kind of came together, that there had to, you know, there was scope in the Russian Revolution for a novel. I've always been interested in the private side of it, the relationships, the love, the influence of family. And so the novel is a great way of exploring that. And then in the end, Anna sort of appeared there ready to go, and she took me for the rest. She took me on the rest of the journey, really. So,
oh, that's wonderful. I've got a question from Amina. She asks, how far do you feel you needed to get into a 1905 Russian mindset for your characters, and if so, how do you go about doing that?
Yes, I suppose that's always the great fear, isn't it? Or certainly for me, you know, because as a historian, I really want to be as accurate as I can be, and you know, it's easy to, you know, look at old pictures and so on to get a sense of the place and so on. But getting in the mindset, the one thing I think I've got going for me is that I've read a lot of memoirs by revolutionaries.
Okay.
So I've heard their voices, I've listened to them thinking about their life and what they were up to, and so that's been the main source that I've drawn from in terms of trying to work out how they would think and act. I'm sure there'd be Russians who would think I haven't quite maybe captured the authenticity completely. But I think the other thing is, you know, I've drawn a lot on just being just thinking back to being a university student, you know, 150 years ago. You know, that thing you have as a student where you know the answers, you're full of enthusiasm, you want to fight the good fight, you feel invincible. And I think that I've sort of tapped into that a bit as well, to sort of understand what these revolutionaries must have felt like.
Okay, from Alan. I was thinking of the parallels with women in the Maquis, am I pronouncing that correctly, and maybe Northern Ireland.
Yes, in fact, another friend of mine is in the audience, and she wrote her dissertation on a comparative dissertation on women terrorists. Yes, I mean, I imagine, you know, I've consistently stripped away from my terrorists things like, there's one argument that Russian orthodoxy encourages sort of a particular form of self-sacrifice in the women, but again, I wouldn't necessarily say that that's the case. I think that the heart and soul of the terrorists is about relationships and belief in injustice. And I imagine that unites women terrorists across the globe, really.
Okay, here we go. Why, this is from Alexandra, why, after the Bolsheviks came to power, did they exclude the women's movement from the discourse about revolution? For example, the moment when women achieved suffrage in the spring of 1917.
Yes. The Bolsheviks get into all sorts of tangles with the women's movement, and women's specific role in the revolution, because for them, they want this to be a workers' revolution. They think that class identity and class loyalty is the thing that unites the revolutionary force in Russia. Okay, so it's got to be a workers' revolution. And the minute you start specifically identifying women as a specific group within socialism, you begin to fall into a trap of feminism, where, you know, the notion that part of the working class might have different needs according to their sex and gender has a danger of splitting the working class. So they're very keen for everyone to be united in class identity rather than sexual politics. So they're constantly trying to batten down on that and be a sort of universal revolution for the workers. And that creates all sorts of difficulties, aside from the general prejudice about women's capabilities and so on and so forth.
Right, exactly. That's the problem that you find in archaeology. I'm an archaeologist and an anthropologist. And the second we try to imagine people in the past, almost always these agents of change in the past have a male face. And so when they're going forward and trying to bring change, they decide to make it universal, but universal is shorthand, and many times for male, which is a shame. We've got one from Janice Parker. Oops, it just went away. Hold on a second. It was up a little bit. If you see it, you can find it. Let me see. There we go. Do you think, I agree with this, Janice. Do you think that writing a novel also reaches more people than an academic paper would? And also that a novel brings across the emotional aspect of the revolution in a way that an academic paper wouldn't?
Yes, well, certainly on the emotional reach of a novel, I think that's a really important part of history that can be explored best in a novel. And certainly there's, you know, there is actually at the moment a movement towards trying to do the history of emotions, but it's as you can imagine, it's incredibly difficult to do it with the kind of historical mechanisms we would expect in an academic paper.
Right.
As for reach, I don't know. It would be wonderful if it did. Certainly, there's always a problem in history where women's history and academic study that deals with women's history does tend to become siloed, and so it doesn't necessarily reach to the general histories and the grand narratives of the revolution. So perhaps a novel is better at crossing the sort of gender divide there. It would be lovely if it was.
Right, exactly. I'm going to be doing a book about workhouses, and we're thinking of including a short story, actually, just to show how do people end up in a workhouse. This is from Nikki Emery. Hi, Katy. You shared the fantastic paintings by Natalia, I'm going to completely botch this name up, by Natalia Goncharova and Ilya Repin. Could you say a bit more about the role of progressive artists and designers in the period of the novel? Do any appear in your story? Oops, do any appear in your story making posters or other propaganda, for instance? I'm curious because Nicholas II's aunt, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fedorovna, from Hessen originally, was a patron of the avant-garde Art Nouveau Jugendstil designers and architects.
Where to start? Well, I mean, Russia has, until the 1905 revolution, when, you know, freedom of speech comes in, obviously Russia is a deeply censored state. So there's, you know, the argument can be made that it's the artists and writers who are able to explore the social questions of the age in a way that gets past the censors. So in that respect, yes, they can, Chekhov's writing and Turgenev and so on, you know, they are seen as great forces for social change because they're able to get publications out that can be read widely and provoke thought about what's going on in Russia. I have to say I've not quite, I've not got my poster makers or propaganda in there. I've got written pamphlets in there, but not art. But by the time I get to the Bolshevik Revolution, I'm sure I will, because I do love a Soviet poster. So.
That is good. I really love that image that we had a little earlier. I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to open it up to anyone chatting and the rest of that. Oh yes, Diego Rivera certainly used his art as propaganda in Mexico. Yes. And Anna says, this has been so interesting. Just a question, how is this being received in Russia?
My novel.
Yes.
It's not there yet. I mean, obviously, I'm hoping it'll be a bestseller, but yeah.
Well, it may end up there. Let's find out.
Who knows?
Let's find out. I have really enjoyed this. I've really enjoyed this. Shane, thank you so much for your time tonight. Thank you so much chatting with us and bouncing ideas and questions off of Katy. And I really enjoyed that. I feel like I've sat through a really enjoyable class where I won't have to do a test. And Katy, thank you for coming here tonight. And thank you everyone who has joined us tonight. Thank you so much for being here. This has been a really lovely way to talk about the background of the novel and to also honor International Women's Week in a very international way and to look at something more than just Western civilization, but to look at something else. And I have really enjoyed this. This has just been so fantastic. I'm going to ask Alan to put the link up again. This is part of International Women's Week, but we are really going to be promoting Katy's book, which will be launched. It will be released toward the end of April. And if you pre-order it now, instead of £10, it will be £9, but also free shipping. And shipping keeps going up and up and up. So that saves you definitely a few quid. We do print also in America, and we print in other countries. So if you are in America and listening, and I think a few people are, thank you. We'll see what we can do about the shipping within America too, because we're going to be printing it in America and shipping it from an American printer to you in America. So we're going to work on that. But meanwhile, I want everyone to unmute themselves and let's thank Katy and Shane. I have really, really enjoyed this. Please unmute yourself and thank you so much, both of you.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you.